You are going to learn how to make your colors luminous today. Welcome to our guest, David Langevin. David, where are you coming to us from?
I live in British Columbia in the southern interior, I guess you could say, in Kamloops, BC. It's a small city, about 100,000 people.
And you have a lot of mountains around you, I suspect.
We're in the mountains here, yeah.
Yeah,
and the Rockies are just a couple of hours east of here, and the Coast Mountains a couple of hours west. So I'm right in the middle of it. Great place to be for landscape painting.
Absolutely. Do you do a lot of outdoor painting as well?
No, Eric, I'm not much of a plein air guy, I gotta tell you. I love hiking and I take photographs, and that's my reference stuff. I just like to keep moving when I'm out there in the beautiful alpine meadows. So,
well, there's no right or wrong. I just was curious.
That's right. We're going to learn more about that today too in my presentation.
There is a right or wrong. Well, tell us what we're going to learn today.
Just briefly, I went to school to learn to be I did a university degree hoping to become a professional artist, and that didn't work out too good for me, actually, because I was hoping to learn how to be a better painter and learn how to make a living doing it, because I'd already been painting as a kid and selling my paintings as a young teenager. So I thought, this is the career for me. But school didn't work out for me. And as you know, the best way to learn this profession is to study with great painters and do mentoring and learn from programs like yours. But I went to school, and I was the kid in school where, the prof would come in and he'd say, well, you just go ahead and do a painting and we'll meet back in 2 weeks to critique. And I was like Mr. Techie Head, right? So I was like, well, if I'm painting in oil, should I paint on cotton or linen? Like, is that a thing? Or how come there's 3 kinds of black? And the prof said, well, you're not supposed to use black. And I'm like, really? What's that about? And there's 3 kinds of white, and some brushes are $30 and some are $3, and I'm on a student budget. So, like, should I invest in the $30 brush? Well, so I had all these technical questions, right? And so what I decided to do is I spent years studying in conservation libraries and books, learning how to paint like the old masters, because I wanted to be an expert in materials and techniques. And so I've made it my mission to teach the sort of nuts and bolts stuff. And I don't bother going into all of the aesthetics about composition and design and color. And so many great artists out there and so many great resources like yours teaching people how to make great paintings. So I just focus on the technical stuff. And what I'm going to do today is a presentation of 7 principles or guidelines, I guess you could say, that great oil painters for 500 plus years, all the way from Van Eyck to Van Gogh. And they focused on these 7 things, and they used these guidelines to help them create the most dynamic and vibrant color effects possible. And so, yeah, the thinking here is that it's not that you always want to do that in a painting, but the thinking is, if you know how to create the most vibrant, dynamic color effects, then anytime in a painting you need to do less by dulling or calming down or making it more muted, then you have the creative flexibility and expressive freedom to do that. So that's what we're going to dig into today. Okay, we'll get into it. I've got my trusty whiteboard here, and I'll start by just telling you that how I came to understand and learn this stuff. I mentioned I went to university and didn't learn what I wanted to learn. I'm just the kind of person who, if I decide to take something on, I want to be quite good at it. And I had already learned to paint on my own. I was sort of self-taught as a kid. And then later on, I learned to paint like alla prima, impressionist style. And when I discovered the paintings of the old masters, and I'm talking Renaissance, high Renaissance, Baroque period, so painters like Correggio, Titian, Caravaggio, Raphael, those great painters, I wanted to understand more about how they put their paintings together. and I'd been painting in oils. And so as I was studying that, I was doing it through conservation books mostly, and charts and reference material that I could find through conservation libraries. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you these 7 principles that I noticed great painters from, like I said, from Van Eyck all the way to Van Gogh. These painters were concerned about these 7 guidelines that help them create brilliant color effects. And the important thing to understand here is that these are principles and guidelines, and they're based on laws of nature and physics, but they're not shoulds, they're not do's and don'ts, they're not laws or rules that you need to follow to make great paintings. There's thousands of ways to make great paintings. What this does is it teaches you the properties that go into creating very brilliant color effects, and if you know how to make those, then you can make, and it just gives you a wider range of expressive possibilities and freedom. So that's what we're going to dig into. Now, before I get into that, I have to cover a couple of basics things, and then I've got them written out for you. I hope you can see those there, and we'll go through them one by one. But before we get started, I just want to do a really brief history of color, and just to get you up to where we are today, because we're in the most amazing place in history to be an artist. Not just because we have the widest range and availability of products, but also the resources like the one you're watching now with what Eric's doing in Plein Air magazine, and learning to paint from great artists. And that was the problem I had. I went to school thinking I would learn how to paint, but actually the best way to learn how to paint is just like the old masters, find great painters and learn how to do what they do. And so that's what I did, but unfortunately I had to do it through books because all the artists I wanted to learn from were dead. So history of color. Really briefly, for I don't know, maybe 50,000 years, artists had a very limited color palette that was based on iron oxide and dirt. So they had browns, they had carbon, so they had black, browns, and some calcium white. So that was your palette as an artist. If you're a Mr. sort of hunter-gatherer, Paleolithic painter, cave dude, that's what you used for, you know, thousands of years. The Bronze Age, I think we're around 3000 BC, where they were able to forge metal tools, allowed them to pulverize minerals into powder, and then that palette almost tripled, sort of like within a generation. So that was a remarkable technical advancement. And so from the ancient Egyptian time, 3000 BC, all the way up to the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, that was the palette you were dealing with. So somewhere between 12 and 20 colors, depending on where you lived and what you had access to. So that was through the Renaissance, Baroque, and right up until the time of the Impressionists. And that was the next massive technical revolution that happened. And the Impressionists palette tripled again from the time of people like Rembrandt. And that was the introduction of chromium oxide and manganese and cobalt and all of the cadmium colors. So their palette went from, say, a dozen or 15 colors to over 30 colors again within a generation. So we were in the middle of or at the beginning, or maybe, yeah, the beginning stages of the next technical revolution. And our palette has tripled again from the time of the Impressionists. So we've got all of these coal tar and dye industry colors that have exploded the palette to over 100 single pigment colors, and more in oils than any other medium. But like all of those weird, like anthraquinone, quinacridone, phthalocyanine, those are all the new colors. And of course, we have a brand new medium, which is the first time in hundreds of years that we've got synthetic polymer acrylic mediums. And so that's also exciting. Alrighty, going to go through a couple of things on my board here to get you guys up to speed on a couple of really simple principles that I think you'll probably already understand, but it's important to just review them before we get into the 7 steps over here. So let's just do a quick drawing. Wait, I'm going to move that over. So here's me, and you'll notice my remarkable drawing skills here. That's me in my studio. And I'm doing a painting. So I'm looking outside because, like I said to Eric, I'm not much of a plein air guy, so I like to paint indoors. So I'm looking through the window, right? And there's a tree over here, and a happy cloud, and some sun. Okay, so we're going to talk about 2 things: bending light and reflecting light. You're back in school, guys. Okay, so this is about bending light. So if the window is clear and clean, I can see straight through it, and the light passes directly through the window. You guys get that, right? So I can see in both directions as if there's no window there. Now, if I wanted privacy glass and I didn't want anybody seeing what I was painting, or my little tree, and so if I wanted privacy, what I would do is I would make one side of the glass a little bit bumpy. And you all probably have this privacy glass or whatever it's called on your bathroom windows. It allows the light to pass through, but it makes the glass opaque, and it also makes the glass look white. And that's because now the light is bouncing off all of these little peaks and valleys, and when light comes into your visual field from many different directions, you see white. So there's no white pigment in the glass, it just appears to be white. It's the same phenomena that we notice when the lake is calm and we can see through the water, but when the wind picks up and the waves start and the water gets bumpy, it appears to be like the water looks white. Oops, hang on. So it's a basic principle. Oh, and that principle, I'm going to write it out for you because I think it's one of the best quotes you can have when it comes to this, and it's something that Leonardo da Vinci actually talked about. And it goes, when you bend light, you create white. So when you bend light in your paintings by creating bumpy surfaces, you add white to your colors. Simple, obvious, and watercolor painters really understand that. Okay, let's talk about reflecting light real quickly. So I'm going to show you a cross-section of a painting. So we've got, there's the paint layer, there's the gesso underneath it, there's the canvas or panel that we're painting on, right? So we're looking at a painting from the side, sort of microscopically. So there's the paint layer, and let's say, for argument's sake, that we've got particles suspended in that binder or medium, and that's, say, ultramarine blue. So reflected light, you guys understand this, I'm sure. There's the blue particle, and that blue particle, when the light hits it, it's going to absorb all of the colors in the light spectrum except for blue, which is going to be reflected back, and we see blue. But here's the thing that the old masters were also aware of. There's no such thing as pure blue. There's pure blue light, but in nature, there's no such thing as pure blue color. There's only mostly blue, because every color reflects back blue plus a little bit of other wavelengths from the light spectrum, and there may be a little bit of extra red in there, which makes it sort of like an ultramarine blue, which is kind of warm purpley blue, maybe have more green in it, which makes it cooler, but you guys get the idea. Okay. let's get on then to how to paint and create the most brilliant, vibrant, luminous color effects that you can create. And number one is, if you paint on a bright, white, smooth surface, your colors will have more pop, more vibrancy, more luminosity. And that's really easy to demonstrate because I showed you the example with the glass, right? It's the same idea here. So there's a painting here. We've got ultramarine blue. Again, that's the same example. So if we did the same painting on a canvas, which is kind of bumpy, and there's the blue layer on top, there's the pigment, right? So we see blue, and here's the rub. If this surface underneath the paint is smooth and white, then the light will pass directly through here, and it will come straight back through that paint layer, and it will brighten it up with light. So this blue is going to pop. It's going to have more vibrancy. When you paint on a bumpy surface, the light's going to come through that transparent layer of the binder medium, and it's going to bounce off those peaks and valleys in all these different directions. And you're going to see blue plus white. That makes total sense, right? So this is going to be a little bit more muted, and I wish I would have done this for you guys, but I only thought of it this morning. If you did two identical paintings and you did one on a smooth panel and you did the exact same painting on a canvas, they both look fantastic, of course, but if you put them side by side, you'll notice that this one's a little softer, more muted, more pastel looking. This one's more vibrant, more zingy. I'm going to do a share screeny thing here, and I'm going to show you a painting that I did recently. And I'm going to show you how that's illustrated in this painting. Can you guys see that, Eric?
Yes, we've got it up there now.
Okay, good. So in this painting, what I did is on the bottom half, because this is like a Rocky Mountains sort of glacier lake, right? Can you see my arrow moving around too?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Perfect. So in this painting, what I did is it's on canvas, and it's acrylic on canvas. And this would work exactly the same with oil painting. I do both oils and acrylics, exactly the same methods. And so what I did here is that because the canvas is a little bit bumpy and I wanted this water to be very translucent and luminous looking, so what I did is in the bottom half of the painting, I put several more layers of gesso and I sanded it very smooth, and I left the top half a little bit more bumpy. And I took a photograph of the painting in the early stages so you could see how I managed that. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Am I doing this right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So I've got this orange imprimatura, the first layer here, and then in the bottom half, what I did is I put a burnt umber glaze, and then I took some rubber scraping tools and I scraped away all of these rocks and logs. So that's not paint, that's just the gesso showing through the layer. And so what I wanted to do is use that luminosity of the gesso to give me my transparent effects. And then when I paint the glazes and veils over top of it, I get that effect. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense.
All righty. So that's number one. Let me get out of the screen share here. Okay, I'm back.
Okay.
Okay, number two, this is a tough one for students like I was, because I'm telling artists that if you want to make paintings and you want to have the the greatest amount of flexibility and expressive freedom, then you need to invest in really good quality paint. And I'm going to do a little diagram here to illustrate that. So I'm going to use an example of expensive paint. This is economy brand. And this is cheap paint. So let's say, for argument's sake, that that's $30, less than half price at $12, and then $5 for this tube of paint here. So here's my tube of paint. There's my medium tube. There's my cheap paint. Okay, so principle number 2 says use the best quality paints and only single pigment colors. So we've got that divided into 2 parts. So let's deal with the best quality paints idea first. So let's say this is cadmium red. And if you look on the tube, it will have a reference letters and number, and it will be PR108. That's pigment red 108, cadmium red. And we all know that the pigment is the most expensive element in any paint. And so in good quality paints, they're going to use pure cadmium sulfoselenide, and it's going to have a really good load of pigment in there. And that's what you're paying for here. When you get the medium grade paint, it's going to probably be called cadmium red hue. And the word hue is your clue that there's no cadmium sulfoselenide in that paint. Instead, you're going to have the binder, and you're going to have 2 less expensive paints, probably naphthol red maybe, or quinacridone red combination. So it's going to say on the tube PR254 and PR127 or whatever. I don't know off the top of my head what the reference number would be for those 2 colors, but you get the idea. And so what happens when you mix 2 or more colors, if you remember back to our little diagram, then it's going to look a little bit duller.
I'm just going to show, for the purpose of somebody who might not know what pigment is powder.
Yes.
Right? Like that. That would be a powder that they mix into oil.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And so that's a good point, because the same pigments are used to create all the different paints. So you'd use cadmium red, and if you mix it with linseed oil or walnut oil, you get oil paint. If you mix it with acrylic resin, you get acrylic paint. If you mix it with gum arabic and glycerin, you get watercolor, and so on. Okay, cheap paint. You've got the binder, you've got an inert filler that's very inexpensive, and it's just bulking it up. It's like a medium, like a viscous sort of like aluminum stearate or something like that. And then you have a little bit of inexpensive pigment. And the important thing here also to understand is that I said there's no good or bad or right or wrong when it comes to making a painting, but when it comes to permanence, and that's the other thing I'm concerned about with my own art, and the old masters were really concerned about creating paintings that would last for hundreds of years for future generations to appreciate. So if you want your paintings to look good, number one, and you want your paintings to last, then you should be using the best quality paints, because paintings made with this the paint will not be flexible or durable. And I'm going to screen share again just to show you a little swatch that I painted, which really does a good job of showing you the difference here. And there it is there. So there's the 3 paints examples. So you've got cadmium yellow and cadmium orange, and you can see the expensive paint has nice body to it, and it's opaque, which is what we want from our cadmiums. Of course, we want them to be opaque for our luscious alla prima painting techniques. You can see the economy paint. I put that black line underneath it, and the cheap paint you can see is quite transparent. So you'd have to load it on really thick to get any kinds of opacity out of it. The other thing you'll notice is if you look down here, I did a raking light, and you can see that good quality paint should be shiny. That means it's durable, and that means it's flexible, and that means it lasts. This paint will not do well. I'm going to do one more screen share because I went and I made 3 paintings back here. I'm getting pretty good at this, Eric. I had to practice a little bit. Having said that, oh, there they are.
There they are.
So there's my 3 paintings.
No, you know, they've come off.
Can you see them now?
There we go.
So these are the 3.
Yeah.
You got that, Eric? Okay,
yeah,
great.
we have it.
So there's 3 identical paintings. I made these simple little paintings with these birch trees. And that's the expensive paint, that's the medium grade paint, and that's the cheap paint. And you can see how different those effects are. But the important thing to notice here is, of course, this painting is going to look even worse in about 10 years. But the other important thing to recognize here is that I probably like the middle painting the best. It's not a preference thing, it's a technical thing. You can get this paint to look just like that if you want it to, or you can get it to look like that if you want it to, but you lose all of your, a wide range of expressive freedom by using this, and even more by using that, because there's nothing you can do with these paints to give you that kind of luminosity and color intensity that you get from high pigment load, good quality paint. All right, I got one more screen share for you guys. I'm back here. We're going to go to part 2 now. And I'm going to talk about the second part, which says use only single pigment colors. Okay, that there on your left, the left part of your screen, that's sap green. And that's not a single pigment color. So what you'll find is that manufacturers will produce somewhere between 60 and 80% of the colors that they produce will be single pigment colors, only one pigment in the tube. And the rest of them will be combinations of 2 or more colors. And what I'm suggesting is that rather than get the manufacturer to mix paint for you, buy those individual colors. And if you like, for example, if you like sap green, because it's a nice natural looking green, especially for landscape painters, if you like that color, and I'm telling you, find out what the pigments are and make your own versions by mixing any different way you want. And I did 4 versions of here, and there's hundreds of variations, obviously, that you could create with these 4 pigments to create different types of sap green. But these versions are just glazes and veils in alternating layers using the same 4 colors. And I just get different versions of it. And they're more, to me, they're more interesting, they're more luminous, they're more painterly, they're just a whole lot more interesting. And learning to manage color like that, I think, makes you a more skillful painter. Okay, let's get back out of here. How are we doing for time? I think I'm moving along pretty good here. Well, you're muted there, Eric.
About 15 minutes there.
I'm in 15 minutes, or I got 15 minutes left?
You got 15 left.
Okay, let's blaze along then.
Time flies when you're having fun.
I am having fun. I like teaching this stuff. And I got to tell you, if I could have traded this 40-minute lecture for 4 years of university, I would do it in a minute. Okay, so Number 3 says, if you want to create the most brilliant and luminous color effects, then minimal amount of blending you will do. Let me show you this. I'm just going to hold this up in front of the screen there. Can you guys see that? Is that in focus okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah. So this is 3 basic ways to mix paint. So over here on this side here, you've got, it's just yellow and blue and white, and they're all mixed together on the palette to create a nice neutral, soft, sort of muted looking green. And then we go over to Van Gogh here, and he doesn't want to do a whole lot of blending. He just takes those 3 colors a la prima straight out of the tube, and he blends them in a nice sort of mushy painterly looking swath there. And over here we have 3 different ways of creating green without using white, but using transparent layers instead, with glazes over top of it to give me my values. And under this one over here, it's just a grayscale, like a grisaille, and I glaze the blue and yellow over top of it to get dark, medium, and light green. And here it's just blue over yellow, and there yellow over blue glaze. But anyways, there's also any number of variations and combinations of these 3 ways to create green colors. But what I think is interesting is that as artists, one of the things we look to do when we're doing these illusions, these 2-dimensional illusions of landscapes and whatever we're painting, what we're doing often is we're using reflected light to manipulate the viewer's attention. And one of the powerful lessons I learned from artists like Rubens was that he would use all 3 of these techniques in the same painting, because what they do is they have a different effect on the viewer's attention because of how they reflect or absorb light. And so you'll notice this green is kind of calming and neutral. This sort of patch of color pops and jumps out at you. And this one recedes and pulls and draws you in. So it's a rest, push, pull. Let me bounce back to that painting that I showed you earlier, just so you can see how that comes together in this painting. So in the foreground where I wanted that transparent water, you can see the glazes over top of that underpainting. They pull you into the painting. And then where I used these opaque highlights with whites and cadmiums and some greens and yellows here, that sort of pops. And then where I mixed my dominant warm and cools to create my neutral gray tones, you have those rest areas. All right. Let's see if we can race through the next couple. These ones shouldn't take quite as long. Use gloss mediums to dilute your paint to make glazes and veils, and your colors will have more vibrancy than if you use matte mediums. If you want your final color effect, your final picture to be less shiny and glossy, but you still want your colors to have pop and luminosity, then I would suggest using your gloss mediums to create those effects in your painting to maintain that luminosity. And then at the end of the painting, you can put a matte or satin varnish on the final picture to take that glare or shine off of it. The other thing, and this is an aesthetic thing, but it's also a technical permanence thing. If you dilute your paints, especially oil paint, if you dilute it too much with solvents, you'll get a duller effect, of course, but also you'll strip away too much of the binding strength and flexibility from the paint. And oil paint, as we know, gets harder and more brittle with age, so you don't want to do that too much. Better dilute your oil paints with a good alkyd medium. Okay.
So if you're painting a thin layer underneath, for instance, like a lot of us would paint with a solvent underneath, and then we'd get it thicker on top. You would start out with a medium. What would you do?
So you can dilute your oil paints with solvents up to about 10 or 15% before you start losing too much of that adhesive strength. But it's also a good point because it's important to paint thick over thin and fat over lean, as you know. So yes, in the early parts of the paintings, when you're doing your initial blocking in and washes, you can dilute your paint a little bit with solvents. That's absolutely okay.
Okay. All right, you got 10 minutes.
Okay. Transparent colors for glazes, veils, and tints. So in other words, if you're making a tint with the cadmium red, like we talked about, and you make another tint with transparent red, you'll notice that the one made with the transparent red, although the value is probably the same, if you get it close enough, you notice the one that's made with the transparent red will be more luminous or vibrant. Number 6, I was taught when I was in school that you block in the darks and you start your paintings dark and you do the lights later on in the painting. The old masters, especially during the Renaissance period, were doing it the other way around, where they would paint more like watercolor artists, and they would start with light, and their thinking was kind of, the way to look at it is like a watercolor painter is, the phrase that I like is, the art of painting is the art of subtracting light. So like a watercolorist, if you start with a pure white surface, and as you add washes and colors, you gradually subtract light from your composition. And so that's how I do my oil and acrylic paintings, and that's how the old masters did it. And I do my darkest darks at the end. I'm not saying it's the way you should paint or it's the best way to paint. I'm saying that's the best way to retain luminosity and transparency in your colors. Okay, and the last thing, I'm right on track here, Eric. Paint around things. This one was a stumper for me, because when I was a young artist, I'm going to show you another painting. When I was a young artist, there you go. There's the two paintings again. And this one is painted where everything's painted separately and nothing's overlapped. And in this one, I overlapped objects one on top of the other, and it just kind of sucks the light out of your painting. I'm going to share one more painting that illustrates that. That was counterintuitive to me, because when I was learning how to paint, oopsies, just self-taught artist. Where's that painting I want to show you? Here it is. Can you see that painting now, Eric? So you notice that these trees, like these poplar trees, all of the background stuff was painted around them. I didn't want any of those dark things, like this dark tree. I didn't want that in behind there, because that would suck the light. And these trees, the light color in these trees is actually the gesso just glowing through the thin glazes and veils that I put on top. So paint around things instead of over top is the last one. And I'm back. There you go. You're muted.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
So I'm curious about tell me again, the birch trees that we just saw, if you can pull that up just again real quickly. I just want to clarify that.
Yeah.
Is like you did the rocks in the other painting, you basically just pulled the gesso out. Once you laid in your undercolor, you pulled the gesso out and left it on where the white trees are. I see little hints of color in there.
Yeah, so those are thin glazes and veils painted over the, I'll show you another painting, Eric, that I took a photograph in the early stages, which illustrates it a little bit better. So I'll jump back out.
Hope you guys are finding this helpful. The comments are very positive.
Oh, good. Yeah, it just gives you a couple of extra tools in your toolkit for being a better painter. So there's a nice winter scene for you guys who don't have to live through this like most of us Canadians do. This is an aspen forest. It's just a simple composition with all those trees. And it's an oil painting that I did on panel. And that's what it looked like after the first sitting. So what I did here, Eric, is I put down a transparent oxide brown glaze, and then I used my scraping tools to pull the paint off where the aspen trees are, because I wanted the luminosity of the gesso to shine through. And then when I came to my second sitting after this was dry.
So where did the dark come from?
So you mean like these dark spots on the tree?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's just when I took my scraping tool and dragged it along here, that's the accumulated pile of paint that's just thicker. This brown here is just thicker version of it because I dragged it and scraped it. Do you get, you know, those rubber spatulas you get at the art supply store?
Yeah.
I use those a lot for this kind of thing.
Very good.
Yeah, so this glaze is wet, and I just muck it around with my fingers and my spatulas and my rags, and I create that I pull that white from the gesso through, and then you'll see there it is shining here, that reflected warm light. There's no extra paint on there. That's just the underpainting that I scraped away showing through. And you can see how that sort of deep luminous white is different from the heavy body opaque white that I put on for the sunlight afterwards. And in this part of the tree, that's just the glow of the gesso showing through with a thin purple glaze and a thin burnt umber veil on top of the purple glaze. And they're both, one's transparent, the other's semi-transparent, and it's just showing through that way.
Well, that makes a huge difference in the glow.
Yeah, so different, so interesting. I like to contrast, like I showed you in that first painting of the water. I love using the luminosity and glow of the primer, the gesso, to show the light in my paintings, and contrasting that with the opaque whites is very dramatic.
So what kind of panel do you typically use? So you said you're using smooth panels, or you're putting gesso down and sanding it?
So for my oil paintings, I mostly paint on hardboard. You know what hardboard is? Do you call it hardboard?
Yeah, like an ampersand or a Jack Richardson kind of a thing.
Yeah. It's like they call it masonite or sometimes too. Yeah, so untempered hardboard is I think it's the absolute best thing to paint on. Oil paints really don't like to move around too much. So if you're going to paint them on canvas, you have to prepare them so that the canvas is very stiff and doesn't move or absorb moisture. But up to a certain size, I prefer to paint on hardboard. Right. And it's also a smooth surface, so I like that.
Okay, terrific. Well, this has been fabulous. Would you go through, just read the 7, because they can't read it on the sheet. Just read the 7 real quick.
Oh, is that not clear for you guys?
No, because some people are watching on phones, and maybe somebody will put them in the comments. So the 7 steps to luminous, vibrant.
I'll zoom it in for you there.
Okay. Move your camera up a
Move
little
my
bit.
camera a bit. There you go.
Steps to creating vibrant, brilliant, luminous color effects. You guys can do a screenshot of that. That's one way to get it.
Yeah.
So number one, paint on a bright white, smooth surface. Number two, use the best quality paints and only single pigment colors. Number three, use colors straight with minimal mixing. Number four, use gloss mediums, use solvents sparingly. Number five, transparent colors for glazes and veils. And what's that?
Tints.
Tints. Can you explain, just for everybody's benefit, there are a lot of new painters here, the difference between a glaze, a veil, and a tint?
So any color that you take and dilute to make more transparent, you would call that a glaze. So if you were to add gloss medium to your ultramarine blue and make it thinner and more transparent, that's a glaze. If you add white to that glaze and make it sort of translucent and foggy, then you've got a veil. Okay. And if you just take that blue and add white to it and make a light opaque blue, that's a tint. Does that make sense?
Well, it sounds like a tint and a veil are the same thing.
Well, no, if you take a tint and add gloss medium to it to make it translucent, so like foggy veil, so you can still see the dark underpainting underneath, that's a veil. Think of it like a bride's veil. You can sort of tell that it's your wife, but it might be her cousin until she gets close enough, you know? Yeah. Okay. So a veil, think of a veil like a fog. You can see the dark underpainting through it. A tint is generally opaque.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Well, David, this was fabulous. I think we got a lot of applause in the comments. Maybe when you get off or maybe later tonight, you go into the comments and answer some questions. That'd be very helpful. Yeah. This was really good. I want to show real quickly, because I didn't show many of your I didn't actually show any of your paintings, but I want to just show some here. So just so people can get a feel for them. And I think seeing now afterwards is actually better, because now we understand how you execute. Yeah. Flow. So in the case of this house or these these glowing trees, would that be where you stained the white underneath and then you just pulled it out with the rubber rubber tips?
Yeah, I usually like to do that for the brightest areas. I want to have the least amount of darkness underneath them so that they're going to continue to glow. This is also, I'll just throw this in there too. Most of you probably are experienced oil painters, understand that oil paint not only becomes more warm and yellowish looking as it ages, but oil paint actually becomes more transparent with age. And so that's why the old masters, they painted their light colors very thin, so that as they age, more of the underneath painting shows through. So if you've got dark underneath that, your paintings will get darker as they age.
Yeah, and there's a famous painting, I can't remember what it is. I think it's a horse that has an extra leg now. That's
that's called pentimento. The artist didn't realize that was going to happen. Tried to paint.
I'm working on a painting right now, and I decided to cover a bunch of darks with lights to kind of make the sky pop. And I started thinking about 100 years in the future, if it would, some Goodwill store somewhere. And how that dark is eventually going to bleed through that light.
It will show through, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been terrific. I'll show a couple more of your pieces here. This is similar to what we saw before.
Yeah.
Just beautiful work.
Thank you.
That's lovely.
Yeah, I've got known for my tree portraits. That's kind of what set me off on my career.
Yeah. Well, they're beautiful. Oh, look at that luminosity. Oh, that's not you.
Whoa, I like it.
But now I'll be looking at everything differently. All right. So, David, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Let me just quickly, your website would be David Langevin.com. It's LANGEVIN.com.
Yeah.
All right. Terrific. Thank you, David. We appreciate you being on today.
Thanks, Eric. You're doing a wonderful thing. I just love spending time listening to your shows while I'm painting. Sometimes I have to glance over and go, what is that? Just really good stuff you're doing. And thanks for doing it.
Well, everybody's got a different approach. That's for sure. Well, thank you. This was very helpful. You helped me